Our first speaker today is Professor Ross Kingwell, part of our School of Agriculture and Environment. He's also the Chief Economist in the Australian Export Grains Innovation Centre and a leader of a small group of economists in the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development. Ross also chairs the Australian Farm Institute's Research Advisory Committee, and he's been a co-editor of the Australian Journal for Agricultural and Resource Economics, as well as a former president and now a distinguished fellow, like Michael Burton, of the Australasian Agricultural and Resource Economics Society. And so it's my pleasure to introduce you as our speaker here today, Ross, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much. So for those online, strap yourself in. This is death by PowerPoint. So we've got a lot to get through. So two key tasks today. The first is to outline the likely grain and oilseed market impacts of the war in Ukraine, and then to tell a slightly different story about why farmers' input prices have increased so much. A quick map there of Ukraine to the east, Russia to the north, Belarus to the west, countries like Poland and Romania. If you look at the key statistics with respect to Russia and Ukraine, it's no surprise that we're looking at a Goliath versus David conflict here. The Russian economy is much wealthier. They have a larger level of foreign reserves, a greater level of export revenue. They have a much larger army and a much larger suite of reservists that they can call into action. After the onset of the conflict, many nations introduced sanctions against not only Russia, but also Belarus, because Belarus was the entree for the Russian army. The result of those sanctions are many and varied. The main one, of course, is Germany, where Germany has signalled that it will no longer support the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which supplies natural gas from Russia into Europe. Lithuania has also imposed sanctions preventing Belarus to send some of its fertiliser exports to its ports in the Baltic region. What you may not be aware of is China's support of Russia. 3 weeks ago, China's ambassador to Russia in Moscow addressed Soviet business leaders saying that China was going to undertake massive capital injections into Russia in order to ensure the flight of Western capital from Russia was minimised. China also has journalists embedded in the Russian army, sending back through Russian eyes the unfolding of the conflict. So Chinese people see a very different view of the war to what you and I see on our television screens. With respect to Ukraine's crop mix, there are 4 main crops that underpin grain production in Ukraine. Those crops are wheat, sunflower, corn and barley. Together, those 4 crops make up about 80% of the crop area sown in Ukraine. Of those crops, of importance to Australia is wheat and barley. If you look at the mix of grain production, so the chart on the left is the total grain production through time in Ukraine. The chart on the right looks at the grain exports. You can see that the main coloured bars for grain production comprise wheat, corn, barley, and the salmon coloured one is sunflower seed. If you move to the right, you'll notice that there is no salmon coloured bar appearing in exports. That's because the sunflower seeds that are grown in Ukraine are subject to refining within Ukraine, and it's the sunflower oil rather than the seed that is exported. But nonetheless, the principal grain exports coming out of Ukraine are wheat, corn and barley. What does Ukraine's grain production mean on the world stage? So this is a chart. On the left-hand side is the percentage of the global grain trade supplied by Russia, which is in the purple colour, Ukraine, which is in the blue, and all other countries are in the teal colour. Of the crops of interest, Russia and Ukraine supply 30% of the world's wheat trade. They supply 32% of the world's barley trade. They also supply much of the sunflower seed oil and sunflower meal that is available on the global stage. Of all those grains, the more important ones for Australia are the fact that Ukraine this year may struggle to produce its usual volume of wheat and barley and even sunflower seed, and that has ramifications for grain prices globally. The red arrow shows where we are now in the crop calendar. Down the bottom is wheat. So this is winter wheat that a few weeks ago emerged from underneath snow cover. And what should normally be beginning to happen now in Ukraine are field operations such as the spreading of nitrogenous fertiliser and the application of herbicides. Those field operations now are in jeopardy. So even the wheat that is in the ground and that is growing is unlikely to receive the normal levels of fertiliser application, and therefore wheat yields are deemed to be much lower this year. That's assuming that all the wheat that is in the ground is able to be harvested. More concerning is that over the next month is the start of the spring planting program for corn, for soybean, for sunflower seed, and that's in jeopardy. I've spoken to at least one very large Australian farmer who owns farms in southern Ukraine, and his assessment is that as the conflict continues, then the sowing of those spring crops is in jeopardy for a few reasons. Availability of labour. A lot of the labour, understandably, has gone to defend Ukraine. Then there's the difficulty of obtaining all the required inputs, particularly fuel, to undertake field operations, and then just all the logistics of accessing all the required inputs. Where the Russian army has advanced is shown here. This is from a few days ago, and you'll notice the rose-coloured areas are principally on the border regions of Ukraine, in its north, in its east, and along the important southern coastline. The reason why the southern coastline is strategically very important with places like Mykolaiv and Mariupol is that they are the main ports, along with Odessa, from which grain is mostly exported out of Ukraine. Loss of access to those ports, damage to port infrastructure and transport infrastructure means that even existing supplies of grain that could be exported out of Ukraine are no longer available for export. So it's a double whammy, moving stored grain out of Ukraine, moving grain that should or could be harvested out of Ukraine are in jeopardy. And where does grain production occur in Ukraine? Well, sunflower seed production, of which Ukraine is the global leader with respect to exports, are principally in the southern and eastern parts of Ukraine. Wheat, similarly, is in the southern and eastern, extending westwards into Odessa. Barley, again in the east and south, also extending to some parts of the east. Rapeseed production is principally spread across mostly the central western parts of Ukraine, and that's least subject to alteration. With respect to Ukrainian exports of wheat, where does Ukrainian export its wheat? Principally to Egypt, Indonesia, countries like Bangladesh, Turkey. And it's important to note that some of those countries like Egypt, Indonesia, Bangladesh are, in terms of GDP ranking, poor countries. So the impact for those countries' economies and for their populations not having access to these usual supplies of affordable wheat out of Ukraine is going to pose huge humanitarian and economic challenges for those countries. Similarly, difficulties in exporting Russian wheat occurs. Shippers cannot get insurance on ships leaving Russian destinations. And so the availability of Russian wheat to normal countries like Egypt, Turkey, Bangladesh is going to be problematic. Interestingly, China has overridden all its usual phytosanitary requirements and is now accepting wheat from every province of Russia in order to attract Russian wheat into its borders. With respect to global wheat exports, this is an interesting story. The red line on the chart on the left shows the huge escalation in wheat exports out of Russia. And this has been underway for almost 2 decades. It's meant that since 2015, Russia is now the world's main exporter of wheat. A similar story for Ukraine. That's the yellow block of colour in the chart on the left. It's emerged to now supply up to 10%, 15% of the world's export trade in wheat. So losing easy, affordable access to Ukrainian and Russian wheat spells significant economic challenges for countries reliant on those wheat exports from Russia and Ukraine. For Australia, where does our wheat go to? It principally goes to our near neighbours, and some of those near neighbours, like Indonesia, will now be looking to Australia to fill the void. Normally over 2 million tonnes of Ukrainian wheat is imported by Indonesia. Fortunately for Indonesia, Australia has just experienced a record grain crop of 62 million metric tonnes, of which 36 million metric tonnes has been wheat. So Australia has ample stores of wheat ready to be exported. Our difficulty in Australia is actually exporting the wheat. We just don't have the supply chain infrastructure to readily export huge volumes, additional volumes, that is, of wheat from our shores. The ramifications of all these changes are that already high wheat prices have soared even higher. This chart in the banded light colour shows the range of wheat prices over the last 5 years. The squiggly purple line is where wheat prices were over the last 12 months in 21. The upper line is where wheat prices have been tracking. And you'll see that we are now at historic highs. And those high prices are being translated into a variety of impacts. They are beginning to flow through into grain-based foods such as eggs, beef, pork, chicken meat. Just touching on corn exports, again, Ukraine is an important source of corn exports, Russia far less so. The US and Ukraine are very important sources of corn exports, and a lot of Ukrainian corn has gone to China in recent years. So here's a dilemma for China. Where does it get its 8 million metric tonnes of corn from in 2022 and maybe the year after? Because almost 30% of China's corn just last year was from Ukraine. If they look to the US, then one of the challenges that is currently facing us globally, because remember, the US is the world's second largest exporter of wheat and an important exporter of corn and soybeans, and yet there are significant issues of unfolding drought in grain growing regions of the USA. So the ability of the US to pump large volumes of exportable surpluses of grain into the global economy this year may be challenged. So a few quick take-homes. I think China is going to become a major investor in Russia, and those two countries are going to be increasingly mutually dependent. There's going to be significant disruption to grain production this year in Ukraine. There's going to be long-lasting costs of restoration in grain-related infrastructure in Ukraine, and there may be long-lasting easing of Western countries' grain investment in Ukraine if Russia succeeds in overthrowing Ukraine. The medium-term impact will be a sustained upward pressure on prices of key grains like wheat, corn, barley. Okay, moving on to key inputs. One of the key inputs farmers use is fertilisers. This is diammonium phosphate. This has been the range of prices of DAP fertiliser for much of the last 5 years, but during 2021, an upward trajectory emerged, and we're now looking at very high prices for DAP. Similar story for urea. You know, much of the last 5 years, urea prices ranged in a narrow band. We're now looking at a price spike for urea. And these are global price spikes that are going to affect grain production globally. Even locally, this is our unleaded fuel price in Perth, and no surprise for you online that this has been the experience of motorists. Similarly, glyphosate, almost record prices for glyphosate. So why are these prices increasing? Well, let's start quickly with fuel. These are the countries that are the world's principal suppliers of petroleum. The countries that I've indicated with the red arrow are OPEC countries, and these countries at the start of the COVID pandemic, in light of the reduction in demand for fuel, greatly restricted their production of fuel because they were facing reduced demand. However, as economies have recovered from COVID and demand for fuel has increased, OPEC countries have not increased their supply of fuel. So this chart shows the rundown in global petroleum inventories during 21 and the latter half of 2020. This means that despite the lift in demand for fuel, the supply has not kept up. The result of that is an upward trajectory of fuel prices. Similarly, fertiliser prices. Nitrogen fertiliser manufacture is mostly dependent on natural gas, whereas phosphorus and potassium have to be mined. What's happened with natural gas prices? They've followed petroleum. They've moved strongly upwards in 21. So because natural gas prices have increased, so have ammonia prices. That's led to urea prices increasing. The key countries that are the suppliers of fertilisers globally are countries like Russia and China, and both those countries have made policy choices that have restricted supply of fertilisers onto the global market, and that's driven up prices. China, for example, supplies over a quarter of the world's ammonia. Russia supplies 11%. In 21, China suspended its nitrogen exports to ensure downward pressure on local prices of urea in China to make grain production more attractive in China. In late 21, Russia did the same thing. Similarly, in July last year, China suspended phosphate fertiliser exports, again to lower the cost of phosphate locally to encourage the profitability of grain production in China. Then you've had other perturbations like Cyclone Ida, the second most damaging hurricane in US history. That damaged the USA's Luling plant, which is the USA's biggest plant producing glyphosate. It meant that that plant was out of action for 5 weeks. So the USA lost 5 weeks of production of glyphosate. And remember that the USA is a huge user of glyphosate. Its principal crops being Roundup Ready corn and Roundup Ready soybean. Then you had another set of perturbations, which were the impacts of COVID on supply chains that affected ports. What you may not know is that all the main chemicals, this is not fertilizers, but pesticides, herbicides are imported into Australia via containers. And that China supplies via containerisation 80% of the world's crop protection chemicals. If you look at the rate, that is the cost of getting a container out of China, it's increased in this case about 8-fold. And that's added to the expense of getting glyphosate out of China into countries like Australia. So to wrap up, what's the input story? It's a bit like the crop price story. We're looking at expensive key inputs for crop production in 22 flowing through into 23. So over to you, David.
Ross, do you want to take a few questions before I start?
Yes,
if there's time, sure.
I've got a few minutes of time, so if anyone does have any questions for Ross that they've got burning after that really fascinating and interesting talk, feel free to answer those now, or you can also place them in the chat as well if you don't want to put your mic on and answer in person. Few clapping hands I can see. It was a really fascinating talk, and I guess one of my questions I was thinking along the way is when you were talking about how, you know, the key exporter countries that Russia and Ukraine are exporting their grain to are likely to suffer. And so some of the countries like Australia, where we did have a bumper harvest last year in some of these key crops, is it feasible, if we can overcome some of these bottleneck issues in time in export, to help supplement those international markets that are going to be hard hit by a decline from Russia and Ukraine? Is that at all feasible, do you think?
It's really difficult. You take our home state here in Western Australia, our grain logistics system is set up to handle a crop that is normally around about 15 to 18 million metric tonnes. This last year, we produced 24 million metric tonnes. We just aren't geared up to easily ship out that volume of grain. And so we have grain sitting in grain storage in Western Australia that countries would love to have access to, but it's just physically not possible to quickly move that grain out. And it's almost lamentable that you have a rich country like Australia benefiting from this spike in grain prices, and yet you have countries in North Africa where already there are voiced concerns about the expense of grain, about the expense of farm inputs. So you have people that are going to face malnutrition as a result of this conflict. And you're also going to have the opposite. You're going to have some farmers in Australia that are going to have phenomenally attractive years with respect to the profits. But that's just the nature of the situation. There are winners and losers from conflicts. And in this sense, there are going to be many, many losers beyond the shores of Ukraine. And there's probably inadequate attention given to the unfolding plight of millions of grain consumers in the world that aren't able to grow that grain and must import it. And yet it's a huge expense to their households.
Yeah, it's a very fair point you've made there. Troy Bungie has actually popped a question in the chat asking if the poorer countries can't afford to buy wheat, will that put a ceiling on prices, do you think?
Yes, it will. It obviously it will, because you can't sell if you don't have willing buyers, and that's right. So people will reduce their consumption of wheat. The issue though is that we're talking about staples here. We're not talking about luxury goods. We're talking about types of food that underpin calorific intake. And there aren't too many affordable, cheap remedies.
Yes, mate, that's very true. A little bit scary, but hopefully the powers at the top can figure out ways to get around this for us, because I think you've very much laid out a very clear, pathway of how this could go really badly if it's not dealt with properly and swiftly. So, yeah, lots of food for thought, for want of a better term, there to consider. If no one else has any questions for Ross, I would like to thank him again for giving a seminar today, and he'll still be in the lobby to ask further questions if needed. In the interest of time, I think I'll also pass over now to David,